A group of South African students frustrated over higher tuition fees clash with police outside Parliament in Cape Town. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Since September, student demonstrations have brought chaos to university campuses across South Africa. At that time, the government announced universities could determine their own tuition increases for 2017 as much as 8%. Last year, South African President Jacob Zuma responded to the backlash of student protests by putting a stop to tuition hikes. But this time, student groups remain at an impasse with the government for a solution. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Angelo Coppola in Johannesburg. And Angelo, what are the students demanding right now? Is there a complete freeze on a tuition increase, or are they willing to consider maybe a small increase?
The bottom line here, Anand, is that they want free tertiary education. It started out a little while ago where they wanted free education for everyone. It's now evolved into free decolonized tertiary education. This is an attempt or a call by the protesters to make higher education here more Africa-centric. Meanwhile, Minister Nzimande deflected the fee increase issue away from his office and himself by telling universities that they could actually decide on an increase themselves within a certain cap. Some universities have recently announced that there will be zero increases. Others have said that they're going to need to increase the fees somewhat to keep their university doors open. Protesters have said no increase will be tolerated. They've also frustrated because no government ministers are talking to them, on campus at least, although there has been some closed-door meetings, and it appears that it's a standoff at the moment with protesters preparing to disrupt exams as we speak to make their point. It's not going to end well. Anand?
Now, the South African President, Jacob Zuma, announced the creation of a commission, a task team, if you like, to look into this issue. What is the intent behind that task force, and has it made any difference at all?
And therein lies the confusion. The President announced the commission, and he also announced the task team. The commission was supposed to have submitted a report a little while ago, in fact about 2 weeks ago. What he's received from that commission after all these months of work is an incomplete report. In fact, it's only 50% complete. They've been given an extension until March next year to submit their full report. But bear in mind that universities here in South Africa start their new years in February, with fees having to be paid for classes, and the classes are starting at that time. In terms of the task team, well, that's a different matter. That's been set up by the Higher Education Minister, Bladen Nzimande, and it includes some business leaders. And they've been working on some funding models, and apparently they've found a draft model that they feel that they can work with and they're comfortable with. But it operates on scales. So there's free education for the most needy of the students and their families, which increases in percentage based on family income. And there are loans involved. So certainly no free education for anyone because the state can't afford it. Business is saying that it's going to take control of this new model if it's going to get involved, and it's going to run it on business principles. This, as I said, isn't going to end well. Anand?
Thanks, Angelo. That's CCTV reporter Angelo Coppola reporting from Johannesburg. At the height of the student protest, the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg was forced to suspend classes. Our next guest is Adam Habib. He is the Vice-Chancellor and Principal at WITS, as the university is known. Adam, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, WITS is one of the biggest universities in South Africa, in fact, one of the biggest universities on the continent. What is the situation at the university right now?
Well, let me say, firstly, we're not the biggest. We probably one of the more highly ranked universities, but there are many, many bigger universities in the country. We have about 37,000 students. It is one of the more prestigious on the continent. And effectively, at the moment, we are in the middle of exams. We did have quite a bit of protest 3-4 weeks ago. Unfortunately, we could not stabilize the university without bringing in private security and police. We did bring in private security and police, and for a day or two we had serious disturbances. But since then, we've managed to get stability at the university. The lecture schedules have all been completed as of last week, and our examinations formally began yesterday, and we've had 2 full days of examinations without any disruption.
Now, given all these disruptions that you have had over the past few months, can the 2016 academic year be salvaged?
It has been salvaged. At the moment, we adjusted our academic programs. We lost about 12-15 days of lectures. We adjusted our academic program. We effectively added 2 more weeks on the lectureship schedule. And effectively what that meant is the net loss of academic days was only 3 days. So actually we have finished our academic, at least our lectureship part of our academic year. We are in the middle of examinations and we hope by the end of the month to have concluded examinations. So Wits University is in a fairly strong position. If you're asking the question of other institutions, I think many universities are trying to salvage the academic program in one way or the other. Many like us have proceeded with lectureships and concluded them and are in exams. Some universities have postponed parts of the examinations to January, but we've decided to proceed and finalize them this year.
Right, Adam, these protests have been about fee increases. There's been a lot of damage, a lot of destruction on many campuses. Students have lost a number of days during this mayhem. Is it your feeling that these fee hikes is the protest rather confined to fee hikes, or is it about something more in South Africa?
So look, I think it's about both. I think that firstly, there is a legitimacy to the demand that the cost of higher education has become astronomical by South African standards. Effectively, what you've had for 15 years is government subsidies declining and higher education executives essentially making that up through double-digit fee increases on a yearly basis. And that's priced out higher education outside the hands, not of the working classes, but also the middle classes. So I think there's a legitimacy to the demand. But I also think that the nature of the protests, the tactics, the propensity to violence, the polarization that has emerged, all suggest that it's not simply about fees, that there's a broader unhappiness in the society about the political system, about government, about the state of delivery, about the state of our democracy, about corruption definitely, and all that has manifested itself on our universities and has reflected itself through the medium of the fees must fall protests. So I think it's a combination of things. I've been publicly said that I think that the cause is a legitimate one. Although I've been very critical of the strategies, I've been critical of the racism, I've been critical of the violence, I've been critical of the propensity to arson, and I've been particularly critical on the slogan that has emerged, which is, if there is no free education, there shall be no education at all. And I think that that's a dangerous slogan and advance the struggle for free education while simultaneously concluding the academic year. And I think that that represents the views of the majority of students and the majority of staff. I did a poll 3 weeks ago at Wits University, and 77% of students said they want to conclude their academic year, even though they want to continue to struggle for lowering the cost of higher education.
Right. Ultimately, I guess the fee issue will have to be resolved by the national government. I want you to take a listen to what South Africa's Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, had to say about this. Let's watch.
We understand the concerns of our students and their parents, that we appreciate their difficulties, that we will do everything that is possible to regain normality on our campuses. We do not want them to lose the 2016 academic year.
So you have the Finance Minister there saying that he will do everything possible. Do you see a plan? Does the government have a plan?
The government doesn't have a plan at this stage. The plan that they put on the table, which is by the Minister of Higher Education and Training, was to pay for the fee increase for all students with a family income of less than 600,000, was not accepted by effectively the student parties. And that's why we had the protests. What we are saying is that even though I might be able to finish the academic year and the examinations by police and private security, this is not a sustainable solution. You do not want private security and police on your campuses. And so we need to find a political solution to this. One of the proposals that has been suggested now is, if you like, a national convention on the issue of financing higher education as a means to find a solution between all stakeholders, whether they are students, whether they are parents, whether they are government, vice chancellors and chairs of council. And the idea is that that call is now being made by a number of fairly important elder statesmen, if you like, in South Africa. My Chancellor, Dikhan Moseneke, some judges, Yvonne Mokhoro, some people from the churches, Malusi Mpulwana, and I think that kind of political solution is the best route to a sustainable solution going forward. For now, we'll have the police and the private security, but next year we'll be back to square one unless a political solution is found.
How serious is the government about this? Because the president of South Africa appointed a commission comprising ministers, comprising state security officials. He left out the finance minister, of all people. But that commission produced an interim report on Friday, and I looked at that interim report. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read the whole thing to you, but it doesn't say much. In fact, a lot of it's complete gibberish. How serious are they?
Yeah, so look, I think, well, there's two separate things. The government appointed a task team, a presidential commission to investigate the feasibility. The problem with that is the deadline for that presidential commission to conclude its report is June 2017, and I think that's too late. We just can't fix that. He also established an interministerial task team with mainly state security ministers and the like. I do want to say, however, that subsequently, initially the Minister of Finance was excluded, but he has now been included in the interministerial task team. And that is one of the stakeholders that effectively has to be brought into the conversation in the national convention. Right. I do not believe that government on its own can resolve it. Frankly, I think that there has been a lack of leadership, at least on the part of the president, in this regard. But hopefully in the coming weeks, these elder statesmen can get sufficient momentum on this national convention idea so we can begin the process to finding a political solution to this challenge.
Adam Habib, thanks for joining us, sir.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we need to take a break right now. Coming up, we'll have more on the student movement in South Africa and the history behind the demands for free education. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. Joining us now from Johannesburg is Ayabonga Kawe. He's an Economic Justice Program Manager with Oxfam South Africa and the co-founder of Rethink Africa. Also from Johannesburg is Seppo Kadima. He's the CEO and president of Lonto Coal Limited and a member of the African National Congress. And here with us in the studio is Kenneth Mwenda. He's a Rhodes Scholar, the author of 29 scholarly books and a professor of law at the University of Pretoria. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ayabonga, when we look at these protests in South Africa, they're pretty robust protests. They've got very violent in many instances. Is there a feeling among students in South Africa that they've been left behind? Indeed, there may be that feeling among large parts of the South African population as well, that in post-apartheid South Africa, they've just been left behind.
Well, I think certainly the entry point of the protests is the question of fees and the chronic underfunding of the higher education and tertiary sector in South Africa. But I do think that, the students in many ways, I think, using the fees question as an entry point, are beginning to ask other questions within the society. Chief among those questions is, how do we resolve some of the unresolved grievances that, due to the reconciliation efforts of the early 90s, were left unresolved in order to really hold the peace? And I think students are beginning to ask, what kind of aspirational template do we want for our tertiary institutions? Not only for our tertiary institutions, but also what is the aspirational template of the kind of society we want to build? And certainly, I think within that, there is this sense that many of the students who come from working class and poor communities have been left behind by some of the sort of strides that have occurred in the economy. And many still feel that even though they are in tertiary education, that there's a real perception that many of them have been closed out of the mainstream economy. So it's not just about fees, but I think it's also about how do we address some of the genuine socioeconomic grievances across the society.
Right, Seppo, I think it's fair to say that higher education in South Africa is in a state of turmoil right now. We just heard from Professor Adim Habib from the University of the Witwatersrand. What is your assessment of what is going on South African campuses right now?
Yeah, look, South Africa is at a strategic inflection point, and the fees must fall movement, if it were organized, certainly I think brought us to that strategic inflection point. And the question that I find that it is missing largely from this fees must fall movement is that of what actually constitutes higher education or tertiary education. We've seen by and large that the protests, which unfortunately some of them have been violent, have been led largely by university students. But the further questions that I certainly believe are missing from the debate is what actually constitutes tertiary education or higher education, and if so, once we determine what is tertiary education, to say is the current form of delivering tertiary education being through a classroom, is it still the most relevant and the most appropriate? Or are there technological advancements that can assist us to have our nation overall actually being able to have equitable access to education? So by and large, I think that it is lamentable that the debate and the discussion and the protests have only been limited to only the singular issue of fees without taking into account and considering the much more bigger issues that we face as a nation of ensuring that we have an educated society and an educated citizenry that can indeed help and assist in the economic and sociological transformation and development of this nation.
Right, Kenneth, what we're hearing here is that this fee increase protests, it goes a lot beyond that, doesn't it?
It's a bigger question, Anand. If you look at the whole sort of crisis started about 2015, there is also the feeling of sort of decolonize the higher education system coming through that, you know, to a large extent, higher education has been a privilege of a certain demographic society in South Africa. And so the marginalized have redressed this anomaly.
What does that mean, decolonize education?
Good question. For the most part, if you look at statistics, for example, the larger population of academics are mainly whites in universities in South Africa. And so this is more than 2 decades after apartheid. And so there's a feeling, even from amongst the students and some academics, minorities, that, look, we need to have more diversity and inclusion in higher education. So that's one dimension. Then you have the issue of inequality of incomes. Now, ideally, the world over, public universities, we're talking of public universities here, not private universities, have mainly 3 sources of revenue. 1, government subsidies, and then tuition fees, and the third, usually it's private sources, endowments from alumni and so forth. But we don't have a critical mass of alumni on the African continent who can make big endowments like you have maybe here in the States at places like Harvard. So the universities really are left to look to the 2 primary sources of funding, which is government subsidies and tuition fees. And I think the government of South Africa has tried to try and sort of improve the situation. The statistics are now showing that to meet the shortfall, if they have to deliver quality education, we're talking about 71 billion rands as a shortfall to try and address some of these anomalies. But that's not the end in itself. I think higher education sector all over the continent now, we need to rethink how we deliver higher education. It's no longer the era of state-owned enterprises where these are public entities, they just rely on government services. There are other revenue-generating ventures which public institutions can get into. For example, they can run businesses, commercial enterprises. They can own commercial real estate from which they can get rentals and so forth. Universities in developed countries do that. So we've identified the problem, but we need to look at the solutions.
But when we see what is going on right here, well, look, nothing free. I mean, you can talk about free education. Someone is going to have to pay for it. Right. South Africa's own national development plan calls for 1.6 million graduates by the year 2030. Right. It's falling behind, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, if you look at Germany, for example, Germany, Norway, they're pushing for free education. And so I think South African students are trying to sort of model that approach. But Germany is certainly an advanced economy.
Right.
And I don't think South Africa can afford to do that. And in any event, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's not unusual the type of fees that are being charged in South Africa. You're talking about annual fees, academic fees ranging from $1,000 to about $2,000. That's really nothing. It's a drop in the ocean compared, for example, to the US. Of course, you can talk of kids coming from low-income families and so forth. They wouldn't afford. But there are ways in which you can address that. You can have, for example, scholarships which are merit-based to try and address some of those anomalies. Scholarships for the underprivileged. You can have those type of schemes.
Okay, let me get back to Johannesburg. Yes. Ayabonga, students have a good cause. They have genuine grievances. Not undermining it by resorting to violence in many of these protests, destruction of university property as well. And perhaps in one of their most astounding actions, they were burning down libraries.
Look, I think there's two dimensions to that question. The first one is, from the perspective of the student movement itself. And I think there are many leaders within the student movement who have come out and said they distance themselves from some of the acts of violence that have not only happened on campuses, but also on the streets that happen to sit alongside some of these campuses. But on the other hand, I think we must also acknowledge that there's been a high level of provocation of students. If you look, for instance, what happened in 2015, since that moment up until now in October 2016 and now even in November, you have not had, for instance, at the University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, any day on campus over that year where you didn't have private security on campuses. Now, universities are places for the sharing of knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge, and the generation of knowledge. And I think even in instances where there wasn't large mass action on campuses, you still had this overarching and very intimidating presence of security on campuses. And I think in that kind of environment, you're likely to have a situation where a lot of anger escalates into violence at the behest and provocation of some of these private security companies.
Okay. Seppo, how serious is the government about resolving this problem? We know that the country's President, Jacob Zuma, has put together a group of cabinet ministers to address the issue. Also, state security officials are in this group, but he excluded the finance minister. That's a man who holds the country's purse strings. Does this tell us that the president is serious about addressing this, or is he playing politics with it?
Look, my own assessment is, from what I have seen, is that clearly the government and even those that are involved, the students themselves, the members of the academic staff at these various universities, nobody really has the answer, because if they did, by now we should have seen some sort of a academic literature or research report that would have come out to really give us what are the tangible, appropriate measures that can be put in place. What the government has done to some extent, that is of appointing a commission of inquiry that is just recently released an interim report into its work. I had hoped that that by and large would have convinced the students who are protesting that indeed something is being done. But will that which is being done be to their satisfaction? The answer is no. If one takes into account our very dire economic ourselves in, where in fact we are now on the verge of slipping into negative growth, with an economic policy which is clearly neoliberal, it is certainly means that the government has got very limited financial resources largely to be able to deliver education free. To all believe that the call that there should be a blanket free education access regardless of the income levels or the social standing is itself a correct call, as much as it might be desired, but not necessarily in the current climate that we find ourselves as a country. So certainly I think that all the parties that are involved in this certainly are to take an element of blame. And the students, I had hoped that by now they should have really taken into account these very serious things, because we say that these are the leaders of tomorrow. These students that are in these academic institutions are the very people that we are looking towards them taking the mantle of leadership, and certainly now, in my opinion, they are failing that test. In fact, their conduct is counterproductive to their cause.
Okay, yeah, that interim report that you talked about, that was given to the President on Friday. We talked about it earlier, and it didn't actually tell us much. Kenneth, has the government of South Africa got its spending priorities right? I mean, as Seppo pointed out, there's a finite amount of money.
Right. I mean, again, if you look at issues facing the Treasury, it's a question of different priorities that the Minister of Finance sets, of course, in consultation with the Reserve Bank, the governor of the Reserve Bank, who handles monetary policy. But really, we cannot prejudge them, because right now there's a commission of inquiry that is going on the fees. But what I want to point out is that I think we need to depoliticize our universities on the continent. You know, the universities are not a medium or channel where to air grievances which are of a partisan political nature, masquerading as intellectual arguments. And I think that is very common in Africa. Now, I do understand the grievances of the students, but let's be realistic. There's nowhere in the world, in Africa included, where you're going to get free education. Not even in the poorer parts of Africa. South Africa is a much stronger economy. And South Africa, if you look at the rankings of universities, the top 10 universities, starting with UCT, University of Cape Town, they're all South African universities. They have something that they can hold on to in terms of a quality education. But if we're going to retain the best university lecturers, best academicians, we have to be competitive. There's no doubt about it. And that requires resources. Yes, the government needs to probably give much more consideration to higher education, but I wouldn't preempt them or prejudge them as having gotten their priorities wrong.
So you say the government has to do that, but is there that same recognition of South African universities and their value among students?
Right. Yes, I mean, I hope the students do realize that. The damage has been estimated about close to 44 million rands, I think, in damage to property, as at the latest reports that I saw. And I hope that this violence can come to an end. I mean, we've seen African universities at independence. They all started with all these lofty perks of free education. Eventually, most African universities had to charge. There are a lot of international students in South Africa today, and they're not complaining because they know where they're coming from. That is equally the same thing. So South African students also, I think, need to get a bit of exposure about the international best practices, what happens elsewhere. When you look around the world, you learn something, rather than being very parochial and inside looking, thinking that, you know, you can just get free things.
Right, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.